Good morning or good afternoon, but I think it's good morning for most of us. I am Sylvie Kauffmann. I am in Berlin right now, sitting in the Robert Bosch Foundation, where I'm lucky to be a fellow, and I'm also editorial director of Le Monde. Welcome to the new world, or to the new era. Shall we say that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has opened for Europe. This war has shaken many foundations and parameters of the post-Cold War era. What has the Russian invasion of Ukraine changed for our country's foreign and security policies? How will these shifts affect the European security architecture? Can we think of building a new European security architecture, and under which prerequisites? What will be the EU's role? How will the EU and the UK's interest interact? How will the EU and Nato interact? I mean, these are only a few of the questions that our four speakers will cover during this conference. This is a formidable panel which needs no introduction, but I will just remind you about the four think tanks that they represent, or that they have represented, that this is part of a dialogue that these four think tanks have been conducting since the beginning, more specifically since the beginning of the pandemic. So I think it's a very good opportunity to go further in this dialogue with this new topic of the war of the return of the war in Europe. So without further ado, I think we should get straight into the discussion. But I do have a few housekeeping rules to talk to you about. This is an on the record discussion. We're going to have introductory statements from our four speakers. So Daniela Schwarzer, who is Executive Director for Europe and Eurasia of the Open Society Foundations, and formerly of DGAP in Germany. Then Robin Niblett, head of Chatham House, and then Nathalie Tocci, who is the director of the Institut Affari Internazionali in Rome, and finally Thomas Gomart, director of Ifri in Paris, who is in fact very early this morning joining us from Washington, DC. So we'll have a few minutes of introductory statements from each of you. Then I'll moderate a short discussion among the four of us, or the five of us, should I say. And then we'll go to Q&A with the audience, which is quite important. Quite a big audience today, and we're very pleased for this. This is wonderful, but I will need you to put your questions in the Q&A space, and please indicate your name and affiliation so that I can give you the floor, since there are so many of you. Daniela, I think we'll start with you, if you don't mind, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sylvie. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be together in this setup again after 2 or 3 years of work together. I think, speaking to you from a German perspective, it is very notable that Russia's attack on Ukraine in February led to a very quick and quite substantive shift of at least Germany's security and defense policy. And it essentially burns down to a reassessment, of course, of the relationship with Russia, and what this new situation of an open and aggressive attack on Ukraine means for defense and security thinking. So there were essentially 3 pillars, and I will briefly speak about the sort of, first of all, German response, and then put it into the European context, as Sylvie, you have introduced our discussion is about the security order going forward. But of course, every member state looks at it from their own perspective. And so I would say the major German decision on February 27th, in the speech that Olaf Scholz, our Chancellor, held in a special session, in a Sunday session, in fact, of the German Parliament, outlined this U-turn on Russia policy. First of all, just 3 days before, the government had decided to deliver arms to Ukraine, so into a conflict zone, which, except for very small exceptions, had been a political taboo for Germany. Second element is a change of energy policy. And I guess it's very obvious that Germany had been under strong criticism from the US side and also from European partners on its decision to hold on to Nord Stream 2 over years of pressure from all sides, a deep distrust in the Baltic states and Poland, strong pressure from not only the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration on this project, but it held onto it and eventually found a compromise how to move forward. But then as a reaction to Russia's attack in February, starting in February, Olaf Scholz announced a change of energy policy, a reduction of dependency on Russian oil and gas imports. And this then also entailed, obviously, a stop to Nord Stream 2. And the third element is Germany's defense spending, which was increased substantively. First of all, the announcement that Germany would, as of 2023, fulfill the 2% NATO defense spending targets, which had been agreed years before, 8 years earlier, after the annexation of Crimea at the NATO summit in Wales. But to do this through, first of all, yes, indeed, a higher annual budget, but then an extra fund, which was just agreed last week, finally, of 100 billion euros, which will be spent out over a number of years to really, increase German military capabilities and equip the army, which for years has been analyzed as being totally under-equipped with dysfunctional systems and so on. So it's not about really going into a new era of new, substantively new armament projects. That's part of it, but it is also covering the holes that had built up over the past years where defense spending simply had been too low in Germany. Now, coming from those national decisions to the framing, what does all of this mean in the real search for a new European security order? In the German message, there was both a transatlantic and a deeply European message. The one was on buying F-35 fighter jets in order to be able to participate in nuclear sharing. So a strong message to our American partners, but at the same time, almost in the same sentence, there was a very strong commitment to European and in particular Franco-German defense cooperation. There are about 9 ongoing projects, bilateral projects with some other European partners, some of them in a difficult situation, but there was this very clear commitment to advance both with European and with transatlantic defense cooperation. The second element is really, in a European context, a new realism, I would say, that the war in Ukraine has led to a reassessment of the importance of American security guarantees and American support for Europeans as they have to support Ukraine in her fight against Russia. And this has led to, I would say, a new divergence of views among European partners. To what extent it is a priority to push forward with PESCO and related projects in defense cooperation. Some of them actually see this as a transatlantic moment, and despite the perspective of having maybe a Trump or Trump-like candidate re-elected in the year 2024 in the US, with all the challenges that come for multilateral cooperation with the US under that kind of leadership, There seems to be divergences of views within Europe that are stronger than before on how to and to what extent to push forward with European projects, and to what extent NATO really now has revived itself as obviously the most relevant defense alliance, that the only one for Europeans, but sort of the European dimension of this seems to be less on the radar of at least some EU member states. Yeah, I think I will leave it there for a start. I'm happy to come back in the discussion, but I would say we are really at a moment where it is obvious that the old thinking about Europe's security and transatlantic security is over, that member state investment is key. Germany is moving to, or has moved now with a decision of last week to actually implement the 100 billion euro fund to being the largest defense spender in the European Union, and also in comparison to the UK. So there is a new balance, clearly, in Europe, but at the same time, a very strong commitment to work with Europeans. But I'll leave it there and listen to my European colleagues, what their perspective is.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you for opening already this window on this articulation between the transatlantic link and European defense. Robin, I guess in London things are seen differently, so over to you now.
Thank you very much, Sylvie, and great to be with colleagues from our think tanks, and also to kind of reconvene this group at such an important time. Thank you to Ifri for hosting. Let me, I suppose, make 3 points for, let's say, from a British perspective, slightly channeling the government, slightly channeling my own thoughts. The first obvious thing to say is that European security is now going to be central to the UK and Europe for a long time. It's not just a matter of theory, of organization, of contingency planning. It is real and immediate, partly because personally, I don't know what others think, I see no viable solution to the conflict anytime soon. We're going to end up with some really nasty stalemate that will keep us in confrontation with Russia as long as Putin's. He has sufficient support. I'd be interested to hear Thomas Gomar's views on this. He knows Russia much better. But I think importantly, the horrors committed by, enabled by Vladimir Putin will not be forgotten, and are going to be very much in people's minds in the future. And because they're in the minds, this has been a sort of, people have described it as, look, not just in Britain, which maybe was always had a bit more of a tough line on Russia more broadly. That's more of a consensus view here. But I look at countries like Spain that were traditionally very ambivalent about confronting Russia, where there's a very strong view right now, pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia. I look at countries like Denmark, you know, giving up its veto on joining security and defense cooperation in Europe. And, you know, needless to say, obviously the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, and the speed at which popular opinion literally flipped on its head in Finland, from opposition to NATO being in the 60% range to being 70% in favor in a matter of a month. So I think as Europeans, however, that means we need to think about Europe and European security much more broadly. At the moment, it's all about Ukraine, but things like Kaliningrad is going to be back on the agenda. What does that mean for the security of Lithuania, the Baltic states, for Poland? You know, is Transnistria and Moldova's security, Romania's security for that matter, safe? You know, Snake Island, I didn't know where Snake Island was before this conflict, you know, controls access to the Danube. And is critical, you know, access to the Bosphorus matters, you know, the kind of rights that Turkey does and doesn't have on entry into the Black Sea. So, you know, this whole thinking about European security is going to have to go a huge upgrading from rough comments about Russia to something much more specific and specific capabilities. In London, there's a sense that the government was correct to put European security and Russia as the most immediate imminent threat in the integrated review a bit over a year ago. But the thing that the British government was not prepared for is the very interesting interlinkages between NATO in the EU in what is much more of a sort of full spectrum response to Russia's aggression and future threats. The linkages from sanctions, cybersecurity, energy security, through to the military responses, these all hang together, and it would be incredibly important for the future. It might be challenging for the British government. We'll have to see. They had hoped to focus on NATO and not to have to focus too much on the EU as a security or geopolitical actor. But as we heard just now from Daniela, the EU is thinking more geopolitically right now, and we'll have to see if the UK can get over its, or this government's somewhat theoretical obsessions about the EU and be more open. So that's my first point. European security is center, but it's complex, it's big, it's more than just Ukraine in the future. Second, I think it's important to just remind ourselves in terms of our foreign policy that there is a connection for all of European foreign security between what's happening in Europe and what is happening vis-a-vis China and the Indo-Pacific. I say this because, as we saw in Tony Blinken's speech on May 26th, the US continues to see China as the main threat to international order, broadly writ. The Chinese have, rhetorically at least, been supporting Russia because they empathize with Vladimir Putin on opposing NATO enlargement. And as Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, has put it, you know, America is creating an Indo-Pacific NATO. So as Europeans, I think we need to get ready for a sort of a connection that's going to happen. If you want strong transatlantic security, Europeans are also going to have to make sure they can keep their eyes open to Indo-Pacific security, because the United States is going to be seeing these two things as running in parallel. And very interesting to see Japan, South Korea, Australia, all imposing sanctions on Russia for the first time, because of course they want to say, hey, we're supporting you against Russia. You need to be here to support us against China, perhaps in future years, or next year, this year, and the next decade. And the United States, in a way, as Daniela said, we've suddenly reminded of how important the US is to European security. The US does expect a certain amount of European engagement still in the Indo-Pacific. And with China and Russia sort of interconnecting, not through an alliance, obviously, but this no limits partnership, the fact that they're almost boxed in together, I think the Chinese would rather not be boxed in with the Russians, but they are, from energy through to a sort of geopolitical sense that China is stronger if Russia is stronger, and Russia is stronger vis-a-vis America, means that we as Europeans are going to have to continue to think about security in a much more rounded way. And, I guess I'll come back in the end conclusion. My last point, which I'm going to be very quick on, is I think as Europeans, we have to be very careful not to now go from perhaps putting European security not at the top of the list to then putting it at the top of the list and forgetting about the rest, because most of the rest of the world don't care about this conflict, and including critical neighbors to Europe in the Middle East, in the Gulf, in North Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't need to say to this audience, for these countries, this is like a Cold War 2.0, whose spillovers are affecting their own security, food security, energy security, societal security, in all of their neighborhoods. And it goes much further afield to Latin America, through to Pakistan and India. So somehow as Europeans, we're going to need to show that, and I say this particularly to my British colleagues, because I see some British politicians relishing the return almost to a Cold War, at which Britain has a role again, yeah? But the whole point of global Britain, if you want to use that term, was that it was very much about global resilience as well, integrating development with foreign policy, keeping climate change and global health security at the top of the list, helping improve global infrastructure, not letting the Chinese control that agenda. So somehow we're going to have to show that we can walk and chew gum and that we're open to the rest of the world. So in conclusion, I got maybe more things I can say about some of these elements, but I think European security is more than just NATO, it's more than the EU, it's going to be central. We need to have a broader sort of global understanding of this, keep up our trade policy, keep up our climate change policy, or otherwise the rest of the world will believe the Russian and the Chinese narratives that we've forgotten about them and are just going back to an old way of thinking. We need to think as Europeans about our foreign policy as being not only transatlantic and European, but we've got to keep our eye on the trans-Pacific element, or we will lose America in the long term. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin. And so you added the global dimension to this debate already. So now we're moving to Rome and to Nathalie Tocci. Good morning, Nathalie.
Hi, Sylvie.
It's yours.
Thank you, Sylvie. I hope because I've been having problems with my connection, but anyway, hopefully it'll be fine for the next few minutes. Okay, so let me start off by making a few remarks from Rome, meaning, how has the Italian debate over the course of this war changed, particularly with respect to Russia and more broadly, and then perhaps I'll just kind of connect it to a few broader remarks about where does this leave Europe, essentially. So I would say that in Italy, a change which I would consider to be irreversible has happened. Now, I'm going to start off sort of explaining why in a way which perhaps is not that intuitive, because, of course, the emphasis is going to be on this particular government, this particular prime minister, and, of course, prime ministers come and go. And so it would raise the question, well, I mean, in that case, how irreversible is it? But I do at the same time, and I'll explain why I actually do think it's irreversible in a moment, but I think it's still worth making a couple of remarks about this particular government and prime minister and the positions that it's taken and Draghi has taken in the context of the war. Well, firstly, I would say that, sort of sending weapons, much like in the case of Germany, right? Sending weapons to a third country is not exactly an intuitive thing to do for a country like Italy. It has only really been done once before in the context of the fight against ISIS, so a very similar, in a sense, situation to that of Germany. And doing this towards a third country in a war is really something which may be, perhaps slightly more obvious in London and Paris, certainly not in Rome. And so I think this is something significant which is going on, and despite a public debate and a public opinion that is actually quite divided on this question, the government is keeping at it, and the weapons are being delivered. Secondly, on the support for sanctions, I actually think that here the Italian government has actually been even more forthcoming than what first meets the eye on things like energy sanctions. Not only the oil sanctions which have been approved, but also the gas sanctions, which are unlikely, frankly speaking, to come up for debate anytime soon. This government would obviously not say this openly, but actually, if that debate were to come to the European Council, I think that Italy would be willing to play ball. Which again, considering the level of dependence that Italy has on Russian gas is, I think, also quite significant. Now, this is obviously happening because something else is happening in the meantime, and this is ongoing. And I think in this respect, probably Italy is ahead of Germany, but simply because it's better positioned with respect to Germany on the decoupling, energy decoupling from Russia. the fact that there are sort of energy relationships there, particularly with countries like Algeria, Congo, Mozambique, Angola, Azerbaijan, and the infrastructure is there. I mean, the gas pipelines, right, are there. It's not, this is not only LNG with respect to both Algeria and Azerbaijan. Obviously, we're talking about gas infrastructure, gas pipelines, which already exist, actually have positioned Italy relatively well, or I would say relatively better, in terms of what I think is an energy decoupling, where the die really has been cast. We can debate whether this is going to be something that will be completed by, you know, sort of sometime in, if you like, mid-2024, and yet already by the end of this year, between 75 and 80% of the problem will have been solved. And once you're there, you're obviously politically in a position where it becomes far easier to actually engage in the conversation about an eventual gas embargo. And then I think something else which has characterized this government, which I think probably, well, not probably, actually does mark a bit of a difference, both from Paris and from Berlin, is on the question of Ukraine's EU membership. Again, you know, sort of Rome has actually been rather explicit in terms of support, not for vague ideas of a political community, a geopolitical community, but full, not potential, full candidate status for Ukraine. And again, I think this is also quite significant. Obviously, this relates to a tradition in which obviously Italy has been in general rather open towards enlargement. And perhaps amongst the member states that actually had never really seen a contradiction between the deepening and widening of the European Union. So again, I think, you know, this is something which is quite significant. Now, is this just this government, or is there something more structural going on? I actually think that there is something more structural going on. If you look at it politically, basically what you see is that at the moment, the two largest parties in terms of polling, not in terms of representation in parliament, are both very firmly on the sort of anti-Russia side. So both the Democrat Party to the left, but also the Brothers of Italy on the, in a sense, rather extreme right, but I would say the non-populist extreme right, have actually taken very firm positions against Russia. Now, obviously, there is a populist problem. So both the populist parties on the left and on the right, so the Lega and or rather the Five Star Movement and the Lega, have started, you know, they've started becoming rather more ambiguous, I would say, towards Russia. But, you know, I think that, as I said, you know, the fact that the two largest parties, the two parties that are likely to become the two largest parties in the next parliament, have taken a very clear position, which I think will remain a very clear position moving forward. Alongside this, again, there's the energy piece of it, which obviously consolidates this, this separation. I mean, the minute in which new contracts are being signed, new relationships are being forged, as I said, the die is cast. Even if magically we were to somehow get to some sort of peace agreement tomorrow morning, which obviously is not going to happen, many of these contracts have now been signed, right? So there is no turning back. And so this, and these are long-term contracts, as we know. So there is something, I think, sort of really rather structural, which has happened, where, you know, difficult to see that the tide will simply be turned the other way. Now, is it all well and good? Are there any risks? Obviously, there are risks, as in all of our countries. You know, to the extent that resilience is at the end of the day also about the ability to endure pain and costs. And this is a war which is becoming increasingly costly in you know, politically, socially, economically, etc. This obviously does provide, and it is already providing, in a sense, new ammunition to the populist cause, right? And the question is, you know, the ability that populist movements, and of course amplified by a populist media and disinformation, the extent to which they're going to be able to seize, in a sense, the opportunity. I think the jury is out on this. I really think it is, you know. Mind you, populist movements and parties tried to seize the opportunity with COVID as well. They failed. And so, as I said, the jury is very much still out. Very, very final sort of reflections on where does this leave Europe. I do think that indeed, you know, the beginning of this war really opened up a set of opportunities for Europe, for European integration, to make a number of steps forward. But I do think that on each and every one of them, again, the jury is very much still out. And let me just list 4 and then I'll stop. The first, of course, has already been raised, especially by Daniela, and it's this whole question of, you know, where does all this leave European defense? Well, if we know that there is one organization that is not brain dead, that is NATO. And we know that NATO is going to be very much in the business of the defense of Europe. We also know that there is an increasing, there will be an increasing membership overlap, in a sense, between NATO on the one hand and European security and defense on the other, with Denmark obviously in CSDP and Sweden and Finland sooner, hopefully rather than later, in NATO. So if NATO is mainly in the business of the defense of Europe, and this is the question mark which relates also to Robin's remarks, you know, the extent to which this is a subset of a broader global picture where obviously China and therefore the Pacific are in, where does this leave European defense? So yes, we're going to be spending all this money on defense, and we know where that's headed NATO-wise, but what are the implications for European defense? Both in terms of the funding and the industry side of it, but also in terms of the operations. What kind of missions and operations is European defense in the business of? Especially, and I'd love to hear Thomas and Sylvie or as well remarks on this, especially given that France's appetite for missions and operations, particularly in Africa, seems obviously to have declined quite significantly. So I think that's one set of questions. The second is what I was, already touched on, which is enlargement. Now we're, especially sort of looking ahead at the European Council in a few weeks' time, this is really a moment of choice. Having raised the expectations, rightly so, having embraced Ukraine into the European family, are we going to drop the ball or not? Again, sort of big questions to be addressed. And if we are not going to drop the ball, as I hope that we are not, how are we going to tackle, I think, the only good reason to be kind of somewhat wary of enlargement, which is what happens once countries are in. And we kind of know how countries like Hungary are behaving once in. So how are we going to solve not the enlargement question, but how are we going to solve the internal European questions concerning governance and decision-making and rule of law? Third set of issues is sort of everything revolving around asylum and the embrace of Ukrainian refugees. Great, fantastic. Again, this is a resilient story. How long is this going to last for? Given that we're likely looking at a war which is not going to end anytime soon. And alongside this, to what extent is this going to be used or not as a stepping stone towards actually doing something more systemic and systematic concerning a common asylum and as well as a common migration policy in Europe? And then fourth and final point that I wanted to raise is again back to the energy story. Okay, so now we know that energy security is achieved by decoupling from Russia, as we also know that this means forging a set of other fossil relationships with other third countries. As I was mentioning earlier, these are long-term relationships. Where does this leave the energy transition? Already what we saw yesterday in the European Parliament was essentially a story of the energy transition being a potential victim of this war. So how are we going to go beyond the rhetoric, which of course is one of basically saying, well, the energy decoupling from Russia is part and parcel of an acceleration of the energy transition. We say this, but we're acting, right, in a different way. So how are we actually going to bring these two sort of things in sync, not so much in the rhetoric, but in the action? And I'll stop there, Sylvie.
Thank you very much. And you opened yet more doors to this debate. And there are indeed a lot of doors to be opened. So Thomas Gomart, I'm sure you're going to open even more doors. So over to you.
Thank you, Sylvie. Good morning, everyone. Always a pleasure to have this discussion. So I will try to give the French perspective, a French perspective. I belong to those who take what is said by President Putin very seriously. So I will be back to February 8th, and by quoting President Putin, I quote, ask, and it was a quotation coming from the joint press conference he made with President Macron in Moscow. Ask your readers, your audience, and the user of online resources, do you want France to fight against Russia? Because this is how it will be. So I start with that because from a French point of view, the key issue since the beginning of this crisis, it is its nuclear dimension, which was directly expressed on 24th of February by President Putin in one of his statements announcing the special military operation. That leads to the fact that since the beginning, the French authority, and in particular the French presidents, are very careful about this dimension, which is still, in my opinion, in front of us. I belong to those who take that very seriously, and I don't belong to those who think that it is no, that's business as usual. Don't worry about the Russian deterrence and so on. So I refer also to the message aux armées, which was delivered by President Macron on 28th of February, speaking about unjustified dimension to this crisis given by the Russian president. So I start with that because I think we face Russia, which is conducting a colonial war under nuclear cover. And this dimension seems to me absent from the debate since now, and in my opinion, should be kept in mind. The second point, if there are cohesion between Europeans, which is remarkable, there are cohesion at the transatlantic level, which is also remarkable. But for Europeans, I think it's a very critical situation for one obvious reason. It is the strong disproportion in terms of military supports for the military support given by the US and the military support given by Europeans to Ukrainians. And that's reflecting, in fact, the limitation of European military capabilities, which are to some extent stuck by stocks. And I think that the problem now is the duration of this conflict and maybe the inability for Europeans just to continue to provide weaponry if needed. And in this regard, it will be very, very challenging for them. And of course, the US made this strong effort, 40 billion for a country which is not a US ally, which is not belonging to Nato. So that's something I think on which we should think about as well, with a pending question. What would have been a European attitude without this US military support to Ukraine? And what will be the US attitude if Trump is reelected, for instance? And frankly speaking, I have no clear answer from our US colleagues on this question. Point number 3, one of the direct consequence of this war in Ukraine, it was said by Nathalie, Daniela, and Robin before me, it is the new, to some extent, transatlantic cohesion. I see it on 4 levels. Of course, NATO, it was said, Sweden, Finland joining. We are preparing the Madrid summit. things are clear. I think we should insist also on the financial dimension, because in fact, all these sanctions were taken because of the dollar to some extent. And that's narrow the financial and economic links between both sides of the Atlantic. We are progressing in terms of technological cooperation between the EU and the US. And I think we are now in a situation we know in the past that technological transfer will be related to military alliance. And last but not least, and it was very rightly said by Daniela and Nathalie, the energy dimension. In fact, we are completely reverse our model. We took some gas from the Soviets since the beginning of the 80s. I remember, that the Italian oil corporation started to import, to buy Soviet oil in 1958. So it's a long story. And so we took energy from the East, and we will take energy from the West in the future. So that's absolutely massive. And that's something which should be researched as very, very, very seriously. Last point, what are the immediate challenge we face? The very first one, it is, yes, indeed, there is, after Madrid and with Sweden and Finland within NATO, we will see the evolution, but a new geostrategic configuration, which is favorable for NATO and which is a problem for Russia. Second, we have to ask about what are the different scenarios in terms of timeline for this war in Ukraine. Do we anticipate, something able to stop, I don't know, within 1 year, or do we anticipate something we will stop within 1 decade? I put the two extremes. And what consequences for a country like Moldova, for instance, or for Georgia, which are not so easy to be protected, to be honest. That leads to an immediate question also about, the food crisis. The fact that President Macky Sall came to Moscow to discuss is very telling, And it's telling, it's a paradox, because on the one hand, it was said by Robin clearly, there are many countries which do not want to be involved in this war, directly or indirectly. But at the same time, these countries, and for instance, Senegal abstain, if you remember, are in desperate situation and need to find a way just to avoid, a dramatic food crisis. So maybe it's time also for Europeans with other partners, and we could maybe discuss about the list, to think about a naval operation to make, exportation of grain possible. I stop there.
Thank you very much. Well, you stopped with this very interesting proposal of a joint naval operation. So maybe this will be something we can discuss a little bit later also. There are already questions, and I have to warn you that several of them, of course, touch the Macron issue and his ambivalence or ambiguity or not so ambivalent position on what to do with Russia. And that, of course, opens the bigger debate on how are we going to deal with Russia. But so I think we'll do this during the Q&A session. We'll cover this ground during the Q&A session. I would like to ask you first, before that, since we are all here representatives of Western Europe, if I may say, and Central and Eastern Europe is very much an active part of this debate today and of this new thinking. What do you think of the prospect of a new center of gravity within the EU? Do you think it is going to move east? We are used to this old Franco-German tandem, or sometimes widen to Italy or to the Netherlands or whoever, you know, basically ruling Europe or organizing, maybe not ruling is the right term, but organizing European affairs. Do we see, are we looking at a future where Poland and the Baltic states and Ukraine, when it wins the war, is a more important center of power within Europe, or is it, or do you see this as a kind of maybe Warsaw fantasy? So I'd like to have your opinions. Who wants to start? Maybe Daniela, since geographically Germany is the closest to this new center of gravity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sylvie. I think it's important to reflect what are the sources of power in the European Union, and that is definitely country size, and then voting shares, it is economic power, it is also ability to mobilize resources for European purposes. And if you then look at Central and Eastern Europe, there's definitely a group emerging, while the Visegrad group is split deeply with Hungary on one side and the three others on the other. So this old group of four, which was created in a positive dynamic to help each other to get into the EU and to perform within the EU, and then eventually became more of a blocking group over the past years. This is now definitely no longer a strategic group of four countries when it comes to thinking about the security order and about Russia, because Hungary is the odd one out. But then let's look at the Baltic states and Poland, three very small countries, but very some of the Baltic leaders very adamant, not only now on Ukraine and Russia, but this actually started before that with the developments in Belarus, where in particular Lithuania was very forward-leaning in terms of formulating policy, but also providing active support for Belarusians who came to the EU, had to leave their country. Many of them went to Lithuania. So there's really I would say, a momentum here for the Baltic states to take on a leadership role within the EU. I'm not saying for the EU, because that is then the next question. To what extent can this be translated into actually leading the EU? Or do we see, and I guess that is at the moment my concern, do we see a group of countries, including Poland, weigh in very strongly with regards to their actual commitment to supporting Ukraine? Of course, if you compare euros spent, Germany is still a strong player. But if you look into shares or spending in terms of shares of GDP, the Baltic states and Poland also are ahead of, as you said, Sylvie, the older ones, the old members. Whether this can be translated into a dynamic for the EU, so they actually work as an engine for the whole of the EU, I think we have to look at several things. First of all, I think their impact on the security assessment for the EU will grow. And obviously we saw the strategic compass being published in March and really revised in the very last minute, not because they pushed so hard, but because the general risk assessment of Russia was fundamentally changed for some, for others just confirmed what they had been saying for a long time. But I think it is very important to acknowledge that this rethinking about how could we, and not we, this group, but some of the leaders, I would say, how could some get it so wrong on Russia, has led to a stronger openness to listen to countries when they formulate their concerns about threats to neighbors and also to the EU. Final point I wish to make on the European agenda, stability in our Eastern neighborhood, I think, will continue to be very important. And right now we are engaging in an asymmetric way, as I've said, but with the full backing of the US. I think Europe has to prepare for the moment where the US will be less interested in investing so much as they do right now into Europe's eastern neighborhood. And they will go back to what they continue to consider the major strategic challenge to the US, and that is China, which then eventually means the EU will have to take more responsibility there. And then those countries who have a direct border will be legitimately heard in the European Union and can actually then exert more influence than in previous times.
Thank you. Does any of you want to react to this also? Or yeah, so no, okay. So Nathalie, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to just add a couple of more thoughts. I mean, I think in terms of, you know, so how is it that it is going to shift the center of gravity, if you like, north and east? I think on one level, it is politically. So certainly politically, there has been a recognition, perhaps not shared by everyone, but I think that overall there is a recognition that sort of, you know, in many respects, Western Europe got it wrong. It got it wrong in thinking that by not doing certain things like NATO enlargement, this would magically settle everything and Russia would not be provoked. Wrong. It was wrong in assuming, this is mainly a sort of EU and member state story, that through growing interdependence with Russia, everything would be well and good. Well, no, actually, interdependence was weaponized and it became a source of fragility. And it got it wrong in terms of not taking the agency of countries in Eastern Europe, not only those inside the European Union, but mainly those outside the European Union, seriously. So I think in at least those three respects, there is a sort of vindication of a sort of central, you know, an East European sort of narrative on Europe and European security, which is now here to stay. Now, how does this translate, though, in institutional and in policy terms? I mean, I think very clearly as far as NATO is concerned, I don't think I need to spend too much on that. I mean, it's very clear that within NATO, that center of gravity has shifted. It will shift north and east. As far as the EU is concerned, I'm with Daniela on this. I mean, I think, you know, one really has to look at how this plays out in the sense of, you know, which are the coalitions that are going to be formed on different policy areas. You know, whether we're talking economy, whether we're talking defense, whether we're talking energy and the energy transition, you know, whether we're talking about migration and asylum. It is not as if there is a sort of northern or East European view that is going to prevail. It's going to be about the ability that some of these member states will have in terms of creating a critical mass with countries elsewhere, obviously in the Union, including obviously the biggest ones.
Thank you. There are many. Robin, do you want to add something, or?
I'm just going to add one word very quickly because I know there are a lot of questions and a lot of good ones.
Yeah.
But just one comment to say, I just wonder whether actually the result of this is a stronger voice for NATO in European security rather than the adaptation of the balances inside the EU for the reasons that Nathalie and Daniela mentioned. There are divisions even amongst these groups, divisions in the Visegrad group, different opinions towards rule of law between the Nordics and those in Central Eastern Europe, or some of the governments there at least. So it's really maybe interesting in terms of the balance of power around European security between NATO and the EU as a result of these changes. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you very much. So there are lots of questions. I'm going to group them because some of them touch on the same topic. So I won't give you the floor in the order where you have asked your questions, but in the order of the themes that you are, or the issues that you're raising. So the first group of questions regards Macron and Russia, to summarize. So we'll have Yaron Gambo from Israel, Axel Horhager from Vienna, and Stephen, my colleague and friend Stephen Erlanger. So go ahead, Yaron Gambo, please.
Yeah. Yes, hello. Thank you for this question, for this opportunity to ask a question. So my question was about this idea of saving the face of President Putin, suggested by President Macron. I would like to ask you, what do you think about this as the basis of the European politics towards Russia? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Axel Hager, please. And thank you for keeping your questions short, and we'll have short answers also because time is just running out.
Yes, hello. Thank you for asking my question. It is indeed, I think, mostly to Monsieur Gomart, and it's about the position of President Macron, who still seems very adamant in defending Russia's position as a serious interlocutor rather than a power that is aggressing Ukraine and that has to be, at least in this, definitely defeated and boycotted. So it seems to me France is trying to have it both ways by delivering some heavy weapons, but just single ones that probably produce more complications for the Ukrainians rather than really help them. And on this point of the nuclear option, which I think Monsieur Gomart alluded to earlier, it does seem that France is sort of seeing it as an all or nothing game, whereas of course NATO's and in particular the United States response could be much more flexible, even on the nuclear side, horrible as it may sound, but nevertheless, perhaps more effective in stopping this kind of blackmail by Russia in this field. Thank you.
Thank you. And Stephen, the floor is yours now.
I'll be brief, thanks to everyone. My question is a bit different, which is simply how much damage has Monsieur Macron done to his own ambitions to lead Europe by his delicacy toward Russia, as if somehow Russia and Putin were something you can distinguish between in this particular war. He seems to have offended an awful lot of people, but also strategically, he has struck many people as making a major misjudgment in terms of timing. So that's my question. Thank you, Sylvie.
Thank you very much. So Thomas, I think you are the target of this. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm targeting very often after, every interview or statement by President Macron. Anyway, just to clarify my own position on that, I do consider that this wording of humiliation is completely inappropriate. And for me, Russia is humiliating itself in Ukraine. That's full stop. Now, the real question is in fact the one by Stephen for the timing. I think that there are two things in the French mindset expressed differently by different people, but you have this idea that first, no doubt that France stands with Ukraine, and what is given in terms of weaponry, it's not. It's very substantive at the French level, but once again, this level is in proportion and should be compared to other European countries and not to the US, obviously. But it is something very serious, and it is seriously made on time. So it's to respond to the second question. The second idea is in fact that. Maybe that's a part of debate, and that's why this timing is important to be back to the question of Stephen. We do not consider in Paris that this war is over and that this war will be won by Ukrainians. The strategic surprise, it is the level of resistance, the fact that Ukrainians, resist in this way. It is a strategic surprise. But at the same time, have a look about the military situation. And in fact, all our discussion depends on the timeline we have in terms of when this war could be stopped. And the debate is on that. And it explains a lot, maybe, because I have the feeling sometimes, you know, in some discussions that it's pretty clear that, you know, Ukrainians will win. I'm not so sure, unfortunately. No. President Zelensky said that 20% of its territory is under Russian control. He has now, I think, a real problem in terms of strategic communication. He spoke to all the parliament, to think tanks, to Festival de Cannes and so on, but he has to avoid a sort of fatigue because public opinion, especially Western public opinions, are versatile. And I think it is in the Kremlin calculation. So, you know, just to remind these basic facts, explain maybe a part of the statement made by President Macron. So at the end, and that's the third point, you have all the time this idea, you know, in Paris, which is chaired by other capitals, obviously, that whatever the future of Putin is himself, whatever the future of this war is, Russia will continue to be, you know, on the European continent. So to some extent, it's just to remind also this basic fact.
Thank you. Does any of you, of the other speakers, want to react on this? Robin, go ahead.
Just I mean, maybe I'm being devil's advocate here a little bit as well. You know, it's important that European publics, and I think Thomas used the phrase versatile, that European publics, or certainly parts of them, know that negotiation is going on alongside war. Not just because of the reality of the war that Thomas Gomart talked about, but underlying Stephen's question and some of the others is how long can Western and European unity last? Especially as the costs continue to rise, and they will if we carry on into the autumn and the winter. You know, I'm struck, you know, Macron, I think in this parliamentary elections is up against two parties that are more open to speaking to Putin than he is. And so I just wonder how much, and Thomas will know better than I do, how much of this is targeted at home audiences, not at America, not at the readers of the Financial Times or the New York Times or the Telegraph or whatever. In other words, there's an expectation, and I think, as I understand it, Macron receives a fair amount of support for it in France for being open to talking. I agree, the comments about humiliation were silly, misjudged, wrong, etc., and damaging, actually. But I think in terms of showing an openness to negotiate, although I think there's nothing to negotiate about right now, and I think Putin thinks he can win more, but I think that signal needs to be sent to retain political consent inside European populaces for continuing to support Ukraine militarily.
Thank you. I'm not sure Macron will get a lot of electoral benefit from this. I don't know what Thomas thinks, but personally, I doubt it. Are we okay with this theme? And we move to, I mean, we're not okay with this theme, I'm sure that's not to say.
Can I just ask you or Thomas this? I mean, you're probably right that Macron will not get any electoral benefit from this. But do you think that this is the reason why he did it, or rather that explains the moment? Yeah, because I think Thomas explained why, in general, Russia will always be there, and there will always be a kind of instinct in countries like France or Italy or Germany of basically saying, well, we will need to find a way, right? But it doesn't explain why saying it, you know, why he said it now. So maybe he won't achieve much electoral benefit from this, but do you think that this is the reason why he did it?
Come on, go ahead.
Frankly speaking, I don't know, to be honest. I take the point by Robin about the domestic dimension, even if I would agree with Sylvie. I don't see the political benefits, but the timing for me, it's I don't know. I simply don't know. Mm-hmm. So it's a question you should orient to l'Élysée, in fact, you know.
Yeah. the fact is that this question hasn't been really clearly posed to him. So we don't know, I agree. Okay, let's move to the food crisis, because we have still a lot of questions. And this grain operation, if I may call it this way. So we go to Virginie Robert of Les Echos, Hamza Mjahed from Policy Center for the New South, and Matt Scully of the Australian Embassy.
Yes, hi, this is Virginia. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, wonderful. Something I'm not very clear about that Thomas spoke about, but I wasn't sure what he said, and if you could clarify. I understood, but maybe wrongly, that you were advocating for some kind of military European operation to secure the exports of cereals. Is this something you said? And if it is, how can we go about it?
Okay, kind of Atalante in the Black Sea, or yeah, okay.
Yeah. Hello, I have just a very straightforward question to all panelists, but obviously I think it's Mr. Gomart that spoke about it. And this regards the grain exports. I mean, the fact that Macky Sall went to Russia, is it not a sign that Russia has only been cut from the Western side of globalization? And how does this put Europe? I mean, what was the situation for Europe? Because clearly this means that Europe has lost because of the war, Europe has lost one of its most competitive advantages, which is that there is war and there's no more peace. So are we seeing the formation of new poles of power where Europe is less relevant than before? Thank you.
Thank you. Matt Scully, go ahead. Maybe you're mute, or otherwise we'll just go to the answers. Okay. So Thomas, maybe you start with this operation, this proposal, and then maybe Robin, you have something to say about this also, and Nathalie. Okay, keep it short, please. You're muted, Thomas.
Sorry. Yes, very briefly. About the point made by your colleague from PCNS is a very good one. I think that with this war, Europe lost its main competitive advantage at the global level. Second, the food crisis can be very, very damaging. And, that's also coming back to all an history related to Ukrainian history, the use of food, in fact, as a political weapon. And it seems to me that the fact that the global south is so pressured should be also used to say it's not, and it's a way to respond to Virginie, it's not to say a EU or NATO military operation. I think it should be larger. There are many technical issues, the positioning of the Turks given the control of the Detroit and so on. But that's very complex. But country like Egypt should be involved, or others. But the point is, I think it won't be possible to let Mediterranean countries just in such food crisis if nothing is made to export grain in the next months.
Thank you, Robin, and then Nathalie.
This is such a difficult point, because I think this is just two quick comments. This is where Russia is playing its card, the long game, well and effectively, to a certain extent with China's support. It was almost winning the debate, and we saw in Charles Michel's intervention in the UN Security Council the other day trying to fight back on it. But in a way, the food insecurity of the world and the spiking grain prices are as a result of Western sanctions, not as a result of Russia's war. And in the end, if you need to get food to your population, you go to where the food is. you could say a bit like Biden goes to Saudi Arabia because that's where the oil is. So everyone is making their compromises in this kind of battle. So just to your point about whether Russia is isolated, not isolated, Russia is fighting to make sure it is not isolated and has tools at its disposal. And I think that's what Macky Sall's visit shows. He was planning to go to Kiev as well, but I think he didn't make it there in the end. So that is interesting in itself, but he didn't, he was planning to go to Kiev as well as to Moscow. So I think that's worth noting politically. I think the important question here, and maybe I just want to put this on the agenda in case we don't get to it later, Sylvie, is the role of Odessa. Because, what is an objective of the United States, European governments from this war? As Biden said, and as others have said, it is a sovereign, viable, sustainable Ukraine. If Ukraine loses all of the southern coastline, in my opinion, it may technically be sovereign, but it's no longer really viably sovereign. Odessa will be its capacity to export the grains where the grain is, but I don't think that's the main thing. This is a moment where Europeans, along with America, need to be concentrating on, I hate using the term a red line, but we must be explicit that Odessa's fall is unacceptable. Whatever that means, you can be vague about it. Thomas talked about perhaps doing some type of escorts for grain out of Odessa, or I don't know, maybe out of Ukraine. Maybe Thomas, you can come back on that. Maybe there's other ways. Obviously, there's very slow ways of getting it out via rail and so on. But to me, this is a moment to be focusing about how central the survival of Odessa and the region around it is to the future of Ukraine, and ultimately to its role in global food supplies, and therefore its role as a viable, effective sovereign country. And whether that means talking about armed escorts out of Odessa, I don't think it's feasible right now. But even talking about it is a pointer and a reminder, as Thomas raised it here, and everyone's talking about it, so I'm glad Thomas raised it. Is this where Europeans and Americans will put their effort? And so I think there's a connection between global food supplies, Ukraine's role in it, what a sovereign Ukraine means. So I don't care whether we talk about armed escorts. I don't know how it would happen. Would it be UN? But to challenge Putin, to say, they can only lift the mines and demine the port if there is a ceasefire or some type of stop in the conflict, because there's no way the Ukrainians will demine Odessa if they think the Russians can come in behind it and basically sell the grain they've already taken from Ukraine through other ports. So to me, these things are really interconnected. I've probably spoken for too long already, but I wanted to get this point on the table.
No, it's a very good point. And I'm going to do something before I bring in Nathalie and Daniela. I would like to give the floor to Denis Verret, who has a question about Turkey. So that, since we're talking about the Black Sea, please go ahead, Denis Verret.
Thank you very much for the discussion. Yes, my question is which benefit Turkey will get and which price Turkey will have to pay for its current veto against accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO.
Thank you. So Nathalie and then Daniela.
Okay, so a couple of words on this operation idea and then on Turkey. I mean, on the sort of naval operation to get the grain out of Ukraine, I think that this is absolutely what we should be doing, both for the reason, or let me put it this way. What is the risk in doing it? Well, obviously the risk in doing it, assuming that this would not be done through an agreement with Russia, given that there will not be any sanctions relief, it would have to be done regardless of Russia. So obviously the risk is that such an operation, if it was a European operation, could be attacked by Russia. So obviously there's a big risk there, and it's important to acknowledge it. But I think it's equally important to acknowledge the risk of not doing it. And the risk of not doing it is both what Thomas was saying, i.e., we're talking about an extra 50 million people at risk of famine in the world, with all of the consequences that leads to, including for European security. But also, I think the point that Robin was making, i.e. the fact that if we don't do it, Russia will win this narrative. It is already happening. Already in the negotiation between Russia and Turkey yesterday, what seems to be emerging is that, hey, this is not only the responsibility is not just Western sanctions that are causing it, so the narrative goes, but it's Ukraine that is not agreeing on demining. So unless, I mean, and Ukraine will obviously never agree on the demining so long as there isn't not just a Turkish naval presence, but an international presence that would secure Ukraine from being protected from Russia. Now, the added benefit is, I think, also what Robin was saying, that this would, of course, the primary purpose of such a corridor, which would obviously remain in place up until when the war is ongoing, so for probably quite a long time. So the primary purpose is obviously getting the grain out of Ukraine, but the not sort of secondary sort of added bonus of this is precisely that of retaining Ukraine, ensuring that Ukraine remains a viable country by securing Odessa and preventing this war from spilling eventually also into Moldova through Transnistria. So indeed, there is a risk in doing it, but in my view, the risk in not doing it is far, far greater. On Turkey, what does Turkey want? Well, you know, we could get into the discussion of, you know, what does Turkey want in terms of PKK and Syria and, you know, F-16s. But to me, actually, the most important thing is that Turkey, in particular Erdogan, wants to use this moment in which, in many respects, Turkey has acquired a very prominent role to secure his election next year. And if that's the case, in a sense, it's almost beside the point what he wants, because anything that he will be given now will be insufficient. You know, whatever is given, he will have all the interest in waiting up until the election and saying, hey, this is what I got from the West. You know, if he's given something now, very unlikely, frankly speaking, that he will, in a week's time or something, change his mind on Sweden and Finland. Because, you know, we know that Turkey is headed in an election where obviously the economy is not something that exactly can be sort of, you know, put forward as a major success given the state of the Turkish economy. So the only way that Erdogan has to secure an election result is by stoking nationalism. And this is the perfect opportunity to do so.
Thank you, Daniela. You're muted.
I agree with all three previous speakers on the importance to really try to transport the grain out of Ukraine. The framing that I observe, which is partially has been already shared, is I think it goes beyond blaming Ukraine. I think the rift that we see emerging between the global South and, let's say, the political West at this point over the war on Ukraine may actually grow deeper and be very harmful, and actually play out in the United Nations and in other contexts on different issues in a pretty fundamental way. Partially because of a different assessment of the situation, and then there will be other situations where different views clash, but it's also a clear moment where Russian and Chinese propaganda work quite well, and in particular Russian propaganda, on the narrative of the war, on the blaming of Ukraine, on the blaming of the West, going as far as saying Ukraine privileges its own sovereignty over the lives of so many millions of people out there. And that is obviously something that is very hard to, you know, to correct and fight back. But it is a big political task for the political West, not only to solve the situation and make sure the global hunger crisis is limited to in some way, but it's also a question of fighting this narrative and regaining weight in the debate, as I said, which I think will spread to other issues as well. I just want to add one thought to what Robin said about the interlinkage of issues here. And in particular, the observation that while I fully agree with your analysis, Robin, that Odessa is so key and the strategic importance is enormous, what I hear more and more is a narrative in countries like Germany, maybe also France, but definitely also others more in Western Europe, that Russia will be fine with not getting full access to the Black Sea. And that may actually be a backup for that position. Yes, that's why we are close to a point where we need to negotiate and basically open that space. So my question in a way to Thomas is whether that might be also the assessment of the French political leadership that this moment has come. And my own personal view on this would be, I don't think we should believe that story for various reasons. And one of them is, of course, that the sovereignty of Ukraine may be maintained in some parts of the country, but if it loses access to the Black Sea, this would be an incredible weakening of the country. And hence in Russia's strategic interest. So I'd just like to bring that back and link it to the debate we had previously on this assessment of, are we close to a point or not where a situation of a ceasefire or even peace negotiations may be close or not? And does that justify, and I don't think it in any case justifies the way Macron has spoken about Putin, that there's more engagement with the Russian side. And my point here is I think we shouldn't be naive on the actual motives of Russia in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Very quickly, Thomas, before we move to the last round of questions, do you want to answer Daniela about whether this is the French position?
No, that's a very interesting point. I should think about, to be honest. For the timing, I have, as I said previously, I have no particular insights, but fully agree with Daniela and Robin to say that Odessa is absolutely the next big, in fact, challenge. Now, for the timing, I would be back to the fact that from the things I read, from the Ukrainian side or the statement, there is absolutely no wish at that time to negotiate, but just to continue to fight. So, I mean, I don't see on the Ukrainian side signals for being ready to any type of negotiation.
Thank you very much. So we have a last round of quick questions and quick answers. Mostly about China, Taiwan, and Washington, the future of who will rule in Washington, D.C. So Patrick Pascal, Pizensu, and Christine O'Clain, please.
Yeah, merci beaucoup. Yes, my question is on the linkage between European security and the Indo-Pacific, as underlined by Mr. Niblett at the beginning of this discussion. In fact, there are two components in that linkage, to my mind. The support of China to Russia is important in the war. To my mind, China lost a unique opportunity to behave as a responsible power and change its, as a permanent member of Security Council, and change its image, but it is its problem. And the second aspect of the linkage is the Indo-Pacific area itself. And then should not we dissociate the problem of the region from Taiwan, the question of Taiwan itself, because there are problems. We know that 90% of Chinese exports are transiting through China Sea. And also there's a question of Taiwan Strait, very important for nuclear submarines based on the island of Hainan.
Okay.
But Taiwan, let's imagine that in the future, would China conquer Taiwan in a peaceful way? What would we say? Because it's part of China, it's our doctrine.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Pizensu, Berlin, I think, yeah.
Yeah, hi, this is Pizensu from Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Berlin. Robin and Daniela, you mentioned about the Indo-Pacific and the China, and also a tension between the US. So I have two questions to pose to you. The first one is, what do you think about the tension between China and Taiwan in light of the war in Ukraine? What can EU do? The second one, what prospect can you envision on the security and other cooperations between the EU and Asia Pacific? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Christine, you'll have the last question.
Yes, hello everyone. A quick and easy one to end this very interesting discussion. If Trump comes back, and this is indeed a rather short-term issue, what could be common EU and UK scenarios within and outside NATO? Thank you.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes for these 3 very easy questions. So who wants to start? Robin, do you want?
I'll have a go. I'll have a go just very quickly.
You don't have to answer the 3 of them.
No, I mean, I just want, if it was one question to me, I suppose, on EU-UK, if Trump were to come back into power, or somebody very close to him, I presume you mean in 2025 rather than through the midterm elections, he'd find a NATO where he could say, they've done everything I told them to say. Everything I told them to do, they've done it. I was brilliant. You know, they're now spending on defense, et cetera, et cetera. And even better, they're buying our gas, just as I told them to do as well. So as Daniela said earlier, this incredible shift from, from west to east in terms of the oil supplies and, gas supply in particular. So, but who knows who'll be in power in the UK by then, by the way, because there'll be a British election by then as well. So it might not be Boris, at least by that time in 2025. What I would say is that what I said earlier, there's an increasingly close internet connection. I think there will be between EU approaches to security and NATO approaches to security, partly because of overlapping membership. And the UK by then will be starting to get into a more comfortable relationship with the EU. And because it won't be worried about European armies, it's more likely to be able to do something helpfully in that space. I did want to say something very quickly about nuclear weapons, and I'll be very quick to simply say it. I said this, I got a question from Zelensky about this when he did a thing with Chatham House 3 weeks ago. And to Thomas' incredibly important point about nuclear weaponry and all of this, if we accept Russian blackmail with nuclear weaponry now, it's not only a lethal precedent in Europe, it's a lethal precedent globally. In other words, other countries will learn the lesson. So one has to take it incredibly seriously and reject the blackmail. If Russia is not being attacked, it cannot use that blackmail. I mean, because if you let it use that blackmail, it will be used in other ways. And there are all sorts of ways to follow through on that analysis, but I'll just put that out there, incredibly important. And I do think, and though I don't have the answers to it, that Arisya Lucevich's question, she's a colleague from Chatham House, about what are the future security guarantees we will offer to Ukraine needs to be thought about now. Because it's probably not going to be a NATO guarantee, but it means the countries on this call, represented maybe by the 4 of us, are going to be central to what those guarantees are. They might be partly energy. They might be partly being a viable sovereign country, as Thomas mentioned. They will be partly defense and defense support. It may be training, forces going out there regularly, but we are going to have to uphold Ukraine's security in the future in ways that are much more active than they were prior to February 24th. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, there are many very good questions that we're not going to be able to take, but I think we'll have to do another session for this, including about Ukraine security. Nathalie, go ahead, quick.
Yeah, I mean, just I agree with everything Thomas has said. I mean, what Robin has said. I mean, I think on the Asia question, to me, the big question, which I think is the debate is settling, but it hasn't quite settled, is to what extent is this war a subset of a broader global confrontation, which obviously centers around the US and China. There are obviously linkages there, but exactly to what extent is this a European war as opposed to a war in Europe, which is part of a broader global confrontation? I don't think that we've sort of quite settled that. On the security question, just to kind of, I guess latch on to Robin's last thought there, not only do I think that given that, I mean, of course, it would be ideal to have the Ukraine in NATO, in my view. I think in retrospect now, we know, well, we know that a Ukraine not in NATO has ended up in war. We don't know, obviously, whether a Ukraine in NATO would have ended up in a different result. But still, the fact that that question is there, I think, has made me at least personally change my mind on that question. But I think regardless of what I think about it, it's unlikely that this is going to happen. Given that this is not going to happen, I think that the security guarantees a la Article 5 that individual countries will need to provide Ukraine are critical, and they will need to be provided, I would say, even in a scenario, which I think is the most likely one, in which we're not going to get to a peace agreement. Because precisely in a scenario in which there is no peace agreement, unless those security guarantees, but we get to some sort of low intensity conflict, unless those security guarantees are provided, frankly speaking, there will not be any reconstruction in Ukraine. And we will get a massive problem right in the midst of Europe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Daniela and then Thomas will have
yes,
the last.
We've reached the hour, so I'll be very quick. Just more to the list of countries that Robin has mentioned by saying this group stands for the security guarantees. I would definitely in that regard add Poland. And of course, the Baltic states, because of the geographical proximity and because of their very strong, analysis of the security threats and their engagement right now. So this is, the piece that could then unify the two groups I've described previously in that joint mission to act as security guarantors for Ukraine. On the question of China, I just wish to add the thought to what has been said, that I think the political West's response to Russia's war in Ukraine is very probably very closely read and possibly with some surprise on the side of Beijing, that there is this massive response, that there are encompassing sanction packages. And with that regard, from a Chinese perspective, scenarios vis-a-vis Taiwan may have actually now have a bigger price tag, at least at the moment. So China's interest probably for some years will be not to be decoupled by sanctions from the European and the US market. As we know, the interdependence is both ways. And I would think that both the military resistance in Ukraine and the political and military support response that the West has given to Ukraine will be very, very closely read by Beijing and analyzed as, in terms of scenarios. I'm not arguing that the military support would play out in the same way for Taiwan, but I think the sanctions package indeed is to be taken note of.
Indeed, thank you very much. And Thomas, you conclude, please.
I will take the easy question from Christine. Thank you, Christine, for this question. I asked the same to my US colleagues in a few days, and as I said initially, I had no clear answer. It would be certainly very bad news for Ukrainians. It would be also very bad news for Europeans for obvious reasons. So the ability of the political West to use this good wording to continue this level of support would be uncertain. What is absolutely clear is the fact that Europeans, including the UK by themselves, are unable to make a significant military support in terms of duration. Having said that, the reverse flow in the reverse energy flow I have mentioned create a situation in which structurally the US will continue to be very involved in European security because of these energy supplies. So it's maybe a way for me to mitigate the first part of my response.
Well, thank you so much. We had the dream team of the think tanks, and it was, thank you very, very much for this very rich and lively discussion. I think we will have to do it again, definitely, because there are so many issues that we have touched and we have not touched. So thank you very much, and thank you for the audience and the great questions. Merci, à bientôt. Bye-bye. Thank you.